Welcome, everyone. I'm Vince Staley, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders, and I'd like to welcome you all to our call on Reporting in a Dangerous World, How Global Media Philanthropy Can Address Journalists' Security. This webinar, it's one of our monthly journalism webinars, and today we're going to hear, we're going to get a preview of our own forthcoming report on global media philanthropy from one of our report's co-authors, Sarah Armour-Jones. And I don't want to steal any of Sarah's lines, but I will note that one of the most important findings in our research was the degree of concern we heard about threats to journalism. And so today we're going to hear from the authors of two essays on this critically important topic from within the report, Marius Dragomir from the Central European University Center for Media, Data and Society, as well as Rowan Reed, a program director of journalist safety for Internews. And hopefully we'll also hear from all of you in one way or another. The easiest way for you to participate is through the Q&A function, which I think you'll find at the top left of your screen. You can use the chat function as well to communicate with any of us individually or as group. And we'll keep an eye on the Q&A as well. Fiona Morgan is our head of the Journalism Network for Media Impact Funders, and she'll keep an eye on the questions that are coming in as well. We're going to hear, I think, from Jessica Edwards, who's with Doc Society working on their Safe and Secure program, where they're helping filmmakers, journalists, other media makers to keep safe in their work around the world. We're going to have a sort of informally go to her after our speakers have shared their perspective. And we have the ability to promote anyone on the call who knows how to use the Zoom platforms and knows that their mic is working. So if you have something to say, we can also go beyond the Q&A function to actually hear from any or all of you. And we know that there's some very interesting and knowledgeable people on the call, on the webinar today. So we know that some of you have a lot more to offer as well. But with all of that, I want to turn it over to Sarah Armour-Jones to give us a little bit of a scan of the research that she's done for us. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, Vince. It's great to be here with everybody. So since 2013, Media Impact Funders has been doing a lot of work with Foundation Center to map the landscape of media philanthropy. And it started out with a US focus, and we sort of relaunched a global map a couple of years ago, or maybe more than a couple of years ago at this point. And the picture for US media philanthropy is pretty clear. But in our work and in our research, we know that the picture for international philanthropy is not as clear. And that's for a variety of reasons, including differences in philanthropic structures and lack of consistency in reporting or even ability and safety of reporting. So we feel it's really important for funders to have a sense of what's going on outside of the US as the world gets smaller and smaller and more connected. And with funding from the Gates Foundation, we were looking to get a clearer picture of the media funding ecosystem around the world, which obviously is a really big mandate. And we were looking for ways to sort of narrow our focus. We did a lot of literature review. We did some informal conversations along with MIF longtime consultant Jessica Clark. We really were trying to scan the horizon to come up with a cohesive way of approaching the world and media. And we landed on a couple of topics, journalism especially because of a great focus among our members and just funders in general. And then we realized that we have a wealth of expertise to tap into, and we really wanted to sort of share expertise from people who were on the ground and had really clear experiences. So we did a funder survey, and I'm going to show the results of that in just a minute. to sort of see what are the most important issues that funders are thinking about. And then we also conducted a survey to intermediary organizations, folks on the ground who are often serving in between large funders, particularly funders in the US, with making sort of implementation grants in the field. And we were really struck by some of the discrepancies between what funders were saying was important to them and what the intermediary organizations were saying. So we took that information along with literature review, and we reached out to a number of people. A couple of them we're fortunate to have on this call, because we realized that security and press freedom was sort of this resounding issue that kept being raised. And so I'm going to just run through some slides super quickly before I turn it over. But we were fortunate to have Rowan Reed and Marjorie Rouse from Internews, and also Marius Dragomir to be able to comment on what's happening on the ground, as well as some tools that funders really need to understand and incorporate into their toolbox, and particularly into their funding. So I'm just going to go over and share my screen really quickly. And that's me. Let's see. Let's see if we can get that to move. Okay, so this is some data from our map that I want to showcase, because it shows a really interesting piece of data. This gray line is media content and platforms, and that's by far the largest amount of funding that happens from philanthropic organizations to global institutions for media. And this much smaller line here, black, is journalism, news, and information. And I'm raising that because, you know, the funders that we talk to consistently talk about how important journalism is, and how committed they are to journalism funding. But it's interesting because the data doesn't always show that. And so I think this is a really nice representation of the sort of the lack of journalism funding, while still obviously substantial, $1.4 billion between 2009 and 2015. And I think when the new data comes in, we're going to see, you know, even more, and probably some big peaks in 2016, 2017. But it's just nice to see that comparison of what we're working with when we talk about journalism funding. So the next slide that I'm showing here is on the left. This is the funder response to the survey that we sent. And you'll see that, you know, 100% of the funders that we surveyed were talking about supporting journalism. But when you look over at the intermediary organizations, it's not as much, it's 80%. But conversely, freedom of expression for funders was 50%. And it's 100% for intermediary organizations in terms of what's important. And mobile media also shows this, you know, pretty significant discrepancy. So one of the things that we heard from intermediaries, and one of the sort of big things that I think the report highlights nicely, is that there is often a disconnect. And I think it's media impact funders can kind of serve as an interesting convener to have those conversations between larger funders and intermediaries about sort of what's important in their world. And I think it also allows us to you know, highlight areas of commonality and where there can be collaboration. So I'm gonna say that, you know, we looked at this discrepancy between free expression and in journalism and said, all right, we really need to sort of tackle this. And against that backdrop, you know, we're looking at a really pretty grim picture in terms of press freedom. This is a map that we reference in the report, and part of the report highlights Africa in particular, and the journalism situation in Africa, which is obviously huge, but you'll notice that none of the mainland countries on the continent are in green. And so there's not one sort of free country, mainland continent in Africa. And so this is not a happy situation, I think, that we are facing globally. I think we're all really aware of that. And this sort of data, along with the data that we were seeing in the reports, prompted us to reach out to Rowan and Marius to help us better understand what they're seeing on the ground and what the possible solutions are, and how funders both can sort of learn more and also support really important work around press freedom, and particularly around journalism safety and security. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides there, and I'm going to turn it over to Marius, who's going to tell us more about, give us a little overview of his really thoughtful essay about the situation in Hungary, and any more information, as well as what he has learned over his years about what works and perhaps what doesn't work. Thanks, Marius.
Thank you, Sarah. Um, yes, at the moment I'm working in Budapest with the Central European University, the Center for Media, Data and Society, and we do a lot of mapping of the funding in journalism and in news media. But at the same time, as you know, we live in the cradle of illiberal democracy, as it is called in these areas. And but I'm also speaking from my experience with the Open Society Foundations, where I worked with the media program, a grant-making organization that was doing grants to mostly to journalists, to media outlets, but also to policy centers and researchers. So what models work? Well, there are many, but one obvious solution to the crisis of journalism is to support media outlets to do their work, and at the same time to think about the safety of the journalists. And you do that by usually taking them out of the country and giving them the space to produce media in a country or a place where they can do that independently and in full freedom. But now the problem is that in the old days that was very difficult, and I remember that there was the Open Society Foundations. We had the exiled media model, where we were funding news organizations to operate in the country. I remember the example of the Zimbabwean. That was a very heavy operation. The newspaper was edited in London. It was printed at some point in South Africa, if I remember well, and then was shipped across Zimbabwe to the readers. Also in Burma, in the old days, the Democratic Voice of Burma was based in Thailand across the border, but it was broadcast from Norway on the shortwave. So you can imagine how heavy operations these were in the old days. Now things are much easier. Of course, you can do that easily by setting up your online portal and doing broadcasts from other countries. There are lots of examples of such media outlets. What comes to mind is Maidan TV, which is based in Berlin and is doing a great job broadcasting its programs to the population, Azerbaijan. So definitely that is a model, and it can be done easier these days thanks to the new technology and the internet. What is really important as a lesson learned from those days is that even in the most difficult conditions, it was important for all these media outlets to have people on the ground. Of course, in the old days, they worked incognito and they had to hide and do this with a different identity. There were many options to do that, but that is very, very important. It was and it is, in order to keep your contact with what is going on the ground. The second point I want to make is the big discrepancy, talking about the findings that you presented, Sarah, about the funding. When you look at it globally, it looks like a really big sum. Now, when we map this funding locally, it's really the funding that media outlets, independent media outlets, get and operate within in countries in Eastern Europe and so on is far from being sufficient to actually be a very strong competitor in the market. Looking at Hungary, one of the strongest investigative journalism outlets here at Lazo, they do great work and they operate with an annual budget of roughly 300,000. I know that the comparison that I'm going to make is going to be very forced because I'm going to compare it with the public broadcaster in the country, but just to get you a sense of what is going on in terms of the power dynamics in the country. The public broadcaster here gets from the government 300 million euros a year. So you just add 3 more zeros and you can understand in what context these media outlets operate. So the question there, I know that the funding coming from philanthropy is limited, and of course the philanthropy cannot compete with governments or with large commercial players, but still this is a question and this is an issue to think about in an inventive way to try to equip some media outlets to be resilient to this, to the government media outlets and the commercial media outlets, very often close to the government in the countries that they operate. And just thinking about another model that is actually very effective when it comes to securing bolstering the safety of journalists and making journalists more resilient in places like Zimbabwe in the old days, or even today, Hungary these days, is by funding more collaboration work. And this is very important. If you look again at the example of Hungary and many countries in Eastern Europe, most of the journalists that in the country, they operate and they work with government outlets, so they don't really do their work independently. But the problem is that they don't have any other place to go usually. You have only a few outlets operating on the fringes with very small budgets. So there is a really big problem. And very often these people, because they fear their management, they fear losing the job and so on, there is no solidarity in these countries. And the model which was tested by various organizations, including the OSF, was to fund unions, collaboration work. I remember in the old days in Pakistan, OSF funded an association of editors in the country, and that was very, very important for the solidarity and resilience in the industry. So such projects are really important. There are many models already. If you think about ICIJ, OCCRP, all the cross-border investigations networks that operate in the region, they have a lot of impact and they have produced a lot of impact, but I think more has to be done to actually create such collaborative networks for people working within a system, within a country, within a market, within the given borders. So this is roughly three of the models I could think of, and definitely a key issue that appears, and this is something that we were discussing more than a decade ago, is the policy issue. That has a lot of ramifications, and a lot of the things that are happening in many of these countries, the fact that the government is funding these media outlets without any accountability in some countries, the links between the oligarchy media and government media that are happening in many countries, again in Eastern Europe. This is the result of very bad policies that were made by these governments without accountability for many years. So probably I know that is a huge issue, but I think we should bring that back into the discussion, because policy has a big impact on funding journalism, on the safety of journalists, and on the general situation of independent journalism in the country.
Great. Well, thank you, Mariusz, for this overview of your work and your perspective. I will just invite people once again to think about questions, offer your questions individually at any time, and we'll also keep track of them throughout the call and call them forward. I don't think we have anything in the queue for Q&A just yet. But I will note that when we started having these sort of monthly calls and webinars a couple of years ago, it was kind of in the immediate aftermath of the 2016 election here in the United States, when for the first time in our lifetimes, I think, there was a serious pushback on press freedom in this country, in the United States. And one of the first calls we had was with Maria Teresa Ronderos at the Open Society Foundation at that time. And she said, relax, you don't have to do this yourselves. There have been people working on press freedom issues around the world for many years. For the longest time, we've looked to America as helping the rest of the world sort out issues of press freedom. Now those of us outside of the United States can also help you work through some of these issues yourself. But I think what it reminds me of is that actually this is a two-way street, and that we in US philanthropy can understand our role in supporting press freedom overseas, but also the critical signaling role of the United States government in its in signaling the importance of press freedom, and that throughout the world, in Hungary, in Turkey, in various countries all over the world, that political leaders are seeing the ability to crack down on the press, because the beacon of press freedom coming from the United States is less clear and less strong than it has been before. And with that, I just wanted to acknowledge that there's a shift in the political environment, and it's not a permanent shift, but it's one we have to recognize. Now we're going to turn to Rowan Reed. Internews has been doing extremely important work in training journalists, in capacity building for journalists across a broad range of organizational capacity. But Rowan is the program director for journalist safety, and so we're going to hear now from him about his work in this area. Thanks, Rowan.
Thanks, Vince. I just wanted to, before I start, just to clarify exactly what we do in terms of journalist safety. We don't work generally with foreign correspondents or people who report for international organisations. Primarily, we deal with local journalists and sometimes local freelancers or journalists in country who support in terms of fixing or the like for internationals, but primarily we look at supporting local media. What I really want to talk about is the change in the journalism environment, and Vince pointed to it with an increase in impunity for action taken against journalists, and this has certainly been exacerbated by comments made by President Trump, but he's sort of empowered a lot of more authoritarian leaders to take a similar disregard for journalists and journalist safety more broadly. But what we're seeing is previously journalist safety tended to focus on those hostile environments, the likes of Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen, Iraq, those sorts of places, other parts of sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Central America. And certainly the danger is still there for those journalists. Often it's quite untargeted. It's indiscriminate killing of journalists that tends to happen in those environments. What we're seeing now is more and more of the types of high-profile or investigative journalists being targeted. As Marius was sort of talking about, you see a lot of that in Eastern Europe, but you're also seeing it in places like Mexico, the Philippines, in a very unreported way across Francophone Africa, and in South America, Russia, and in India as well. It's starting to become more prevalent. And this is where governments or quasi non-state actors are targeting journalists because of the information they have, or the information or the impact that their work is having within those countries. And so there's that area you're seeing. The other thing that is semi-related to that is you're seeing an increase in imprisonment or the use of legal avenues to control journalists. Again, you can look at countries like Turkey or China, where they're not actually going to go and kill the journalists. They just imprison them or close down media organisations who are reporting materials, information that the governments don't want. This also happens in places like Vietnam as well. Again, the unfortunate part about our broad reporting environment on what's happening to journalists is it's very difficult to track all of that sort of behaviour. CPJ does an excellent job following what's going on with journalists' deaths, as does RSF. They also, both of those organisations tend to follow pretty well journalists imprisoned, but there's a lot more granularity in information that we need to really shape the proper picture, and unfortunately both of those organisations don't have the resources to do it. the final area, which I call the fourth and possibly nearly totally unreported area, is about attacks on rural and non-high profile journalists. And these are beatings. I was in Vietnam a couple of years ago, and I was talking to journalists there, and they said, you know, a reporter probably gets beaten up once every 2 weeks. I have not seen any reporting of that globally. And obviously there's not a lot of reporting of that at a national level. And often that is by local government authorities, by state authorities, local businesses, these sorts of things. And it's very hard for us to capture exactly what's happening. So to me, there's sort of those four areas where we've got risk profiles. And from our point of view as a journalist safety training organisation, we have to really adapt our trainings of different journalists to reflect the types of risks that they're likely to come across. In terms of the types of behaviours that you're getting from the risk actors or the threat actors, what we're seeing is an increase in and one other point, I shouldn't miss this because it's possibly the highest point, is women. We know that women are harassed more online than men. Something from the anecdotal evidence I have, if a woman writes a story that's likely to get trolls or etc., she'll get 4 times the amount of negative comments as a male. And this is not just happening in sophisticated environments. This is happening all over the world. Added to which, women have to deal with their colleagues for sexual harassment or assault. They have to deal with the taxi driver who's going to take them out to do the story. They have to deal with the potential interviewee. And on one particular occasion, I was talking about to a woman in Indonesia, and it was the bouncers, the bodyguards for the governor, or I don't think it was a governor, it was a mayor, who were feeling this journalist up as she's at a doorstop, as a way of disrupting her and taking her off the job. So these are the types of things that women face, and I think it's been really great to see that IWMF has just got a new pot of money for further training of women journalists. So from a training point of view, where we've changed most recently is we've certainly gone to a greater use of greater work around digital security, because what we've seen, say 5 years ago, you were seeing a lot of threat of malign actors using malware and tools to disrupt journalists, and then then became more prominent. You'd get a lot of harassment, trolls, doxing, those sorts of things. Now we're shifting to a higher level as cheaper spyware becomes available, and let's face it, every government is using this, not necessarily on journalists, but on elements within their communities. They use this to track journalists and follow their behaviour, and then use that as a starting point from which they can take physical action against journalists. On top of that, we're now starting to see a greater use of theft of information, data, and then either using that against journalists or basically stealing it to prevent the journalists writing their stories, and also using this as a method to target journalist sources as well, whistleblowers, etc. So what we've done is a couple of things. staying on the digital security side of things, we've started to work a lot more to localize tools to ensure that we respond to the needs of a particular journalist community. Often they use pretty unhygienic digital practices. We're not going to resolve that overnight. We have to work in the space that they're working. If they're all working on Facebook, we have to work out how we can work in Facebook or get them to work in Facebook that's safer for them. If they want to go right down the line of encrypted email, we'll train in that environment. But it's really targeting our training and our curricula to match the needs and workflows of those journalists. We've also, we adapt our responses and scale along those lines. We also are trying to build communities of practice around safety. So in a country like Cambodia, we really, over the last 12 months, we've really tried to encourage the human rights community and the NGO community, as well as the journalists, to come collectively to using safe messaging tools, secure messaging tools that are encrypted, because we see it's a bit of a case of, you know, the last person standing who's not using it is the person most likely to be targeted. So we want to try and bring everyone into that space. And that tends to build a greater support around that sort of thing. From a resilience point of view, we've sort of tried to, again, I'm going to keep mentioning community, and Marius mentioned collaboration. We really try to focus on bringing communities together because it's greater for shared experiences. They find support through each other. There's greater potential for them to advocate together for a change in the environment and those sorts of things, and it really adds to their personal resilience to deal with trauma that is so common with these sorts of attacks. From a physical security point of view, and that was where training was probably 10 years ago. It was based very much on the HEFAT model, the hostile environment training model. We've tended to drift away from that, except for those countries where it's, you know, high profile, like the Iraq, Syrias, etc. In other countries, what we try and do, we know that the local journalists often know the threats and risks better than international trainers, so we no longer bring in the ex-SAS officers to do the training. We work with the local organisations to develop their skills and potentially take people out for training of trainers and things like that, so that they can adapt the physical security components to the local conditions. And we also try to work online to develop strategies around comparing what's going on in different countries, and we try and get in front of the curve rather than responding to it after. So we'll look at a country and see what's going on in the country and try and argue for funding to go and take trainings in that country before the situation changes. I just wanted to pick up on one point that Marius made earlier, and he talked about the opportunities that the internet has presented in terms of we don't need to do this offshore offshoring of journalism is much easier. That is true, but governments are now getting much more effective at blocking sites and what have you. So we're now also trying to work with communities to work out how they can be trained to use VPNs and the like to get around internet blocking before the internet blocking gets in place. So it's a real proactive response, and that's often very difficult to work with donors to get them to an area before the situation's gone beyond repair in some ways. In terms of the really successful strategies, Marius is dead right in terms of collaboration and those sorts of things. But again, our approach is very much to do it locally. So if what we try and do is empower the local journalist unions or the community of journalists to take control of their own environment. We do a lot of training and trainers rather than training, the final beneficiaries. And from our point of view, that's much better impact for the dollars spent and leads to sustainable solutions as opposed to, 12 people being trained. You might train 12 people at a really high level, but our aim is to train 120 people at a lesser level and build the baseline of safety in those countries. So I might leave it there. I'm sure there's plenty of questions to follow out from there.
Yeah, there are a couple questions. Thank you, Rowan, for that overview. Really important points there, particularly I think the empowering the local journalist and serving them in that model of service delivery. I think you would hear that echoed in other organizations and other folks. Christy Hagranis, who's the head of Global Press, I think is saying the same sort of thing in their work. She had a short piece in the Neiman Lab predictions for 2019 and called attention to their work in Duty of Care, which is their program where they provide training for the local journalists who work with them throughout the world. I saw that Alyssa Munoz was registered for this, but I'm not seeing her among the attendees. If anybody from International Women's Media Foundation wants to share their perspective, you're welcome to raise your hand or offer a comment. Jessica Edwards, I think we're going to promote her from attendee to panelist to hear what Doc Society is doing in the Safe and Secure program. Let's see if we can bring her on board and take her off mute.
Okay.
Jessica?
Hi, Vince.
Tell us what you've been working on for a few moments here.
Absolutely. So for those of you who don't know, Doc Society is a non-profit and we're committed to enabling great documentary films and connecting them to audiences globally. We as an organisation have a number of film funds, and we had seen that some of the filmmakers coming to us had a heightened need for safety training and a need to understand more about the issues that they would be facing on the ground in the countries where they would like to film, and some of the more sensitive legal issues around the stories that the documentaries would be telling. And this is something that documentary funders have seen around the world. So much so that in 2016, a group of independent documentary funders came together at the Ford Foundation and recognized there was a real field need. And Doc Society, we put our hands up, we volunteered to take this kind of difficult challenge on, and thus Safe and Secure was launched. So just in a nutshell, we have done various things to tackle the challenges that we're seeing in the documentary field. We have created materials that have been publicly shared, and I'll share the link with the group after this. We have a handbook for filmmakers that covers digital security, journalistic accountability, legal security, and some of the big issues that may come up in telling difficult stories, the physical security side of things. Also not forgetting the importance of making sure that subjects of documentaries are safe too. And increasingly we're seeing, to the point that Rowan made, a sort of a threat coming from big organizations who are using their PR machines to threaten filmmakers. And we've been doing some more work about sort of mitigating strategies around that. So there's a chapter on that in the handbook. We also have a checklist. We have a protocol. So they're all now available for free online. We've also done some trainings. We started off with doing a training for funders in New York in 2017. But interestingly, we've seen a need coming much more from filmmakers as well, particularly filmmakers in parts of the world that are less well served by media. So we started off doing some trainings in the US, but recently we held an assembly for filmmakers working in global media impact. And, you know, we're having filmmakers coming from Turkey, from Hungary, from many, many countries who are desperate for materials in their own languages. And we've just started embarking on translating the materials and making them available. So we have Arabic translations underway and Portuguese translations underway, and we're very keen to make Spanish and French translations available as well, because this is we see this as a kind of a way of really helping our colleagues in the field to understand ways they can work around the challenges that they're facing. In a nutshell, you know, Safe and Secure exists as a training, it's materials, and we also do outreach at festivals, film festivals, to make sure that both funders and filmmakers are understanding the need to take the security challenges that are out there much more seriously.
Great. Well, thank you for jumping in and doing a little cameo discussion with us. Appreciate that. I think it's important to recognize that the different types of media makers, journalists, documentarians, they have distinct needs. There's a lot of overlap, but there are also distinct issues that they face. And to have that varied approach and that sophisticated and nuanced understanding of the different needs is also important for us. So thanks, Jessica. And Fiona, I wonder if you might field, we have several good questions for our speakers. Why don't you tell us what we've got there?
Yeah, let's start with this question from Jessica Clark to Marius. To what extent do you see public broadcasters across Europe working together to protect journalists and create the types of collaborations that you describe?
Yes, that's a really good question about a very important issue. Indeed, public broadcasters across Europe work better than, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago. There is an association, the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, which is bringing together all these broadcasters and working together, doing more studies and doing more projects. But I think mostly active in this organization and in these collaborations are the public broadcasters from Western Europe. Overall, these public broadcasters are grappling with a big crisis of identity. They, especially in the countries in Eastern Europe, they are controlled by the governments. The governments appoint the bodies, the governing bodies of these broadcasters. At the same time, in most of these countries, the funding is coming from the state budget. So you can imagine the level of control of these public broadcasters in these countries. And that makes these collaborations really, really difficult. So it really works. There is a lot of potential there. And in fact, there is a need for more accountability at that level to see how the public funding is spent on the media. As I said, governments are one of the largest players when it comes to funding in the media in most of the countries in Europe. So that is an issue that should be properly researched and transparent. So it works better, but it really doesn't work very, very well. And although there is a lot of potential there, I don't see a great future for the kind of collaborations that I described before when it comes to investigative journalism networks.
Thank you, Marius. There's another great question. I'm going to try to pronounce the name correctly, but we haven't met yet, so I hope I do it correctly. Nishant Lalwani asks, given that the public trust in the media is at a low ebb, as per the Edelman Trust Barometer and Reuters Institute, how do we ensure that the public feel the press freedom is worth defending? Doesn't that assume people think the media is a good thing? Shouldn't we be reframing media freedom and journalist security differently and in a less progressive/liberal way? For instance, is the right to question authority or the right to speak truth to power? Perhaps that would avoid us preaching to the converted when it comes to the public square. A great question. Rowan, do you want to try to take that one?
I'll respond to some of it. I think it's a fantastic question. I do a lot of work in the Philippines, and I know that media is front and center of one of the issues around media there, with a news outlet called Rappler potentially being deregistered because of media's support. So, but one of the issues there is that the media has, the Duterte government's been very effective in delegitimizing the media and the work that it does. And one of the things that the National Union of Journalists and other organisations in the country have done there is to try and rebuild that public respect. One of the challenges I see more broadly is that over the past sort of 10 years, we've shifted away from public interest journalism more broadly to so-called analysis to now opinion. And so that media is much more polarized in terms of its political standpoint. It's no longer independent in terms of the process, the messages that it's delivering. So I think that is a challenge. How we go about how we in the development community go about changing that is a huge challenge, because it's all about profitability at the end of the day. And if you're a commercial organization, it's where your funding comes from. So you're going to, you want to be as outrageous as possible to increase your audience. If you're a state broadcaster, it's likely that you'll do exactly what your communications minister or information minister tells you will do, because that is where your funding's going to come from. So it's a real challenge to overcome that. That said, I think in terms of the way we frame the information, I think it's important from a development side of things, to talk about it as freedom of information for the public, so that everyone gets a chance to hear their whole story. And I think it's also important to empower local voices to be able to, local community voices to be able to tell the stories that are going on in their world. And we need to look at that right at the grassroots level, than focusing on probably the national, highest profile organizations.
If I can add to that, this is Marius. Yeah, if I can add to that just a few, definitely this is the last point Ron made about involving the community is crucial. And just a few ideas for more concrete engagement of the public, because the public trust and the trust in the media has to do with many things. It has to do with perception, how the public perceives the content that they get. It has to do with the crisis of the business model in journalism, because trust at the end of the day translates into monetization, into people who trust a media outlet, they will pay for it. And the fact that we don't have so many working business models shows that there is a big link with trust there. So in terms of concrete things that can be done, one thing is to utilize or to use the institutions that have the setting, have the resources to do journalism. We just rewrote our strategy here as a research academic center. Part of a university, we'll start our own journalism production this year. The management of the university thought that I'm crazy, and there is a lot of pressure there. How do you want? We are researchers, we are academics. I think we have the setting, we have the resources, we have researchers and journalists in the center. We should do that. any other organizations out there that have all these things, they should do that, because the more this will definitely contribute to more journalistic output and trust and so on. Another big thing, as I mentioned, is how people understand from the content that they are faced with, and that is also an issue of trust. And a big problem in that respect has again the relation between experts, policymakers, academia, all these people who live out there. And a big issue there is to translate these big issues into people's to make policy issues, things that are treated in academic papers, into into accessible language for people, and that will attract definitely more people when they will understand what is the impact of all these things on their lives. And finally, I think also this links with my previous experience with a donor, is to try to put the public first when you have a project. And very few people do that. When you have a journalistic project, usually you have the journalists, they think that there is a need for coverage of a certain topic, which is great. They might be wrong, they might be right, but they never, of course, there is a big question about the audience, but you never start a project with the audience. So I think involving the public more in any kinds of these projects is really essential. And I will leave it there.
I will just say, before we go to the next question, we have touched on press freedom and First Amendment issues several times in recent webinars and calls and things like that. And one of the things that I think maybe needs to be drawn forward is this shift to the public. And it's equally not just a freedom of speech or freedom of the press, it's also the freedom to hear, right? And if your freedom to hear things is restricted, then you can relate to it. But we need to maybe use some of that language as well. Fiona, do you have another question?
Well, if I could take the liberty, I kind of want to follow up on that question. A theme of this report being that there's this discrepancy between the importance of journalism on the one hand from the funders, and then the importance of freedom of expression on the other hand. So I'm wondering if this shift to the public if there's something there around trying to center, is this about everyone's rights? Is it about who is a journalist? Is it about the freedom of people to engage with gathering information? To what do you attribute this? And this is for Marius and Rowan. So what do you attribute this disconnect and this framing around freedom of expression for the folks who are closest to the ground?
You go, Marius, and I'll follow.
Well, there are many. I think there are many reasons for that, and there is already a big body of literature on the causes of the loss of trust in the media. One of them is the fact that everything has changed basically in journalism, in the market of journalism, in the news media market, and some of the people in our field, they didn't really catch up with these changes, not involving the public and not listening, as I said, not making them the center of the story. The second is the slowness with the slow evolution of the business models, and only now, after all these years, we see that there are some business models that are working, even in Eastern Europe. The key business model that it really works is the subscription model, and then again is a very big illustration of the fact that the advertising model is gone. It's part of now of the technology companies. They do it. The game is totally changed. What is happening now is that again, this is an important point to make, is that people will trust you, and the moment they will trust you, they will be ready to pay. It happens in countries where people thought that media, television and media should be available because it's out there and it's on the internet. So I think that's a big reason, but there are many other reasons. I think one is the fact that we didn't catch up with how people got empowered by the internet, and they responded more to news sites that spoke to them, and you have the growth of disinformation and the whole other debate about that. So I think there is a bigger problem in how we perceive that, and I think this issue of involving the public, we should take it very seriously. Is not just we should really do that. We should build that with the public, involving the public, and especially when it comes to big undertakings like public media and so on, they should be part of that. This process should be depoliticized.
Just given time, I was only just going to respond to one point. I think Marius has pretty much said it all there. The one danger with the sole subscription model is that those people who can't afford a subscription no longer have access to information, essential information. So there's a whole range of models that we need to evaluate and work with to make a sustainable media ecosystem.
Right. There is one, shall I close out, Vince? There's a question from Nishant Lalwani again to follow up on the freedom to hear. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I would just say, I mean, I don't have a lot more to add to this, except that part of it is just shifting the frame of the question of press freedom, which is largely thought of as the institution or the journalist's freedom to communicate from their side of it, but all of their listeners, all of their viewers also have the freedom to hear. So it's partly just the framing of press freedom as the speaker and the listener, and putting more attention to the freedom of the listener to engage in that journalism. But also I think that media policy plays a big role into this too. So issues like access to the internet, access to net neutrality or other things like that, issues of media policy that ensure that all the audience has the access to information as well. But it's not more fully developed than that.
Great. Do you think we have time for one more question? Okay. So Jessica Clark asked a question for Rowan. What role do you see foundations playing in supporting the role of supporting the work to protect journalists versus other sources of funding? So foundations versus other funding.
Very quickly, there's a couple of things. I think foundations need to take a proactive role in the safety environment. Most donors don't, and that's right across the board. And because of the limited funding available for projects, often implementers don't as well. They tend to look at safety as only something that they put in there at the last moment. One of the things we're trying to encourage across all of our projects, it doesn't always happen, I can tell you that, is that there is a component set aside for safety. There are risk analysis done in the design and the pitching process. That's one thing that I think is really critical. The other thing is that foundations can do a lot of things that the larger donors don't do. They can work on sort of niched areas or niched communities that are often not supported very effectively through international aid organisations and things like that. And the other one I think is really important for for philanthropic organisations is to look at innovation. Most of the international donors are very conservative in nature and often slow to respond. I think foundations can be a lot more innovative and tend to be less risk averse in the way they spend their money, and I think that's really critical in the whole global landscape. So I think there's heaps of opportunities there, and I think private or philanthropic organisations are really valuable in the broader community.
Great. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it at that for the program. I want to thank our visiting speakers, Marius and Rowan, both for contributing to today's conversation, but also for contributing essays to our report on global media philanthropy. Thanks Sarah Armour-Jones and Jessica Clark for writing that report, which will be, stay tuned, we'll be releasing that very shortly. Stay tuned also for our brand new website. We're just about to relaunch the new version of Media Funders website, and then soon thereafter the report will follow. So thanks also for Jessica Edwards to jump in, and Nishant Lalwani for the good questions you've offered. We'll be continuing to pay attention to these important issues, and hopefully we can provoke more engagement in this discussion as well from all of you. So thanks, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.